have always been the kind of person who values personal time and independence. Ever since I was a teenager, I found solace in doing things alone, whether it was walking through an art gallery, taking a quiet stroll along the beach, or just sitting in a cafe with a good book. I am not antisocial, not by any means, but I do not like being forced into responsibilities that are not mine, especially when I do not get anything out of it. And that is exactly what has been happening for the past few years with my family. I am 23 now, but for as long as I can remember, I have been treated like the designated babysitter at family gatherings. My older sister has triplet boys who, to put it lightly, are a handful. They are loud, hyperactive, and have a tendency to completely ignore boundaries. They are just kids, I get it, but the problem is that every single time we have some kind of family get-together, my sister and her husband act like their kids are everyone else's problem. And somehow, I always end up being the one stuck watching them. It started small. A family barbecue where I was asked to keep an eye on the boys so the adults could talk. A Christmas gathering where I was volunteered to help them open presents and keep them entertained. Then it escalated, birthday parties where I was expected to run around after them, holidays where I was the one making sure they did not destroy anything. It became this unspoken rule, if we were all together, I was the free babysitter. Things hit a breaking point last year. My parents planned a family vacation to the coast, which I was actually excited about. I love the ocean, and I especially love visiting art galleries whenever I get the chance. It is something I make a point to do whenever I travel. When my parents invited me, they made it sound like it would be a fun, relaxing trip. They even offered to cover my hotel room and let me ride with them, which I appreciated since it meant saving money. But what they conveniently failed to mention was that I was expected to share my room with my sister's 3 boys. I did not find this out until we arrived. I walked into what I thought would be my private space, only to see 3 little tornadoes bouncing on the beds, already tearing the place apart. My sister and her husband had their own room, of course. No kids in sight. I remember standing there in disbelief as my sister just smiled and said, "Oh, thanks for watching them. We really need this break." I tried to protest, but my parents immediately shut me down. "We paid for your room," they reminded me. "The least you can do is help out." And that set the tone for the entire vacation. I was not on vacation. I was a full-time babysitter. From the moment I woke up, I had to make sure the boys were dressed and ready. I had to chase them down when they ran off in the hotel halls. I had to keep them entertained at restaurants so they did not start screaming. Every single activity revolved around what was best for the kids. I brought up the idea of going to an art gallery, just one small thing for myself, and my sister rolled her eyes. "They will be bored out of their minds," she said. "Why don't we do something fun instead?" I fought for it. I argued that this was my vacation too and that I should be able to do at least one thing for myself. They finally relented, but the whole time we were there, my nephews whined, fidgeted, and complained. My sister made sarcastic comments about how thrilling this must be for them. My parents rushed me through it, barely letting me take my time before saying, "All right, let's go do something the boys will enjoy now." That was it. That was my one activity. By the time we got back home, I was done. Completely done. I moved out of my parents' house not long after that, mostly because I was tired of being expected to help with the kids all the time. I love my nephews, but I am not their parent. And I refuse to keep being treated like an unpaid nanny. Fast forward to this year. My parents announced another beach trip for June, and immediately, they just assumed I would be tagging along the same way. They talked about it as if it was a given. "We will leave early in the morning, and you can ride with us," they said. We already booked the hotel. That was when I put my foot down. "Actually, I am going to drive myself this time," I said. "And I am getting my own hotel room." The room went silent. My parents stared at me like I had just spoken another language. "But, why?" my mom asked. "Because I want my own space," I said firmly. Last year, I barely got to enjoy the trip. I had to share a room with the kids, and I spent the whole time babysitting. I want to actually have a vacation this time. They started to argue. "But it will be expensive," my dad pointed out. "Why would you spend all that money when you can just stay with us for free?" "Because then I will get roped into babysitting again," I shot back. "I have a good job, I can afford it, and I want to do things my own way." That was when the real guilt tripping started. They brought up how my sister needed help with the boys. They said that family should stick together. They told me I was being selfish for not considering how hard it is for my sister to manage 3 kids. I stood firm. She has a husband, I said. Why is it my responsibility to give up my vacation so they can have a break? Apparently, my parents did not have a good answer for that, because they just kept saying things like, but it is tradition, and come on, just keep the peace. It did not end there. My sister called me, absolutely furious. Are you serious? She snapped. You are just going to ditch us like that? Ditch you? I repeated. You mean like how you ditched your kids on me last year? She scoffed. It is different. You are young, you do not have responsibilities. I just needed a little help. A little help? I laughed bitterly. You dumped 3 kids on me for an entire vacation. I barely got to do anything I wanted. And now you expect me to just do it all over again? Well, yeah, she yelled. Because you are part of this family. You are supposed to help. No, I said coldly. I am not your free babysitter. Now she is not speaking to me. My parents are still trying to pressure me into changing my mind, saying that I am making things harder for everyone. They keep saying, it will be so much more difficult without you there to help. Yeah, well, maybe they should have thought about that before taking me for granted. Update 1. The fallout from my decision was like watching a slow-motion car crash, one that I knew was going to happen, but I was strapped in with no way to stop it. After the initial wave of arguments, I thought things might settle down, that my family might finally understand that I had reached my limit. But no, that would have been too easy. Instead, my sister, furious at my refusal to cave, escalated things in the worst way possible. She got our parents even more involved. It started with her telling them how selfish I was being, about how I was abandoning the family and ruining the vacation. What she did not tell them was the full truth, how last year I had essentially been tricked into being a full-time babysitter, how I had been promised personal time but ended up spending every moment wrangling her 3 hyperactive boys. She did not mention how I had voiced my frustrations and had been dismissed because I was staying for free. No, instead, she played the victim, emphasizing how hard it was being a mother to triplets and how I was cruelly turning my back on my own family. At first, my parents were sympathetic to her. I could tell by the way they called me, their voices heavy with disappointment. They tried reasoning with me, repeating the same lines I had heard a million times before, how I should help out because I'm young, how family sticks together, how she needs a break and we should all pitch in. It was infuriating, but at this point, I had built up such a wall against this nonsense that I just repeated my stance without budging. Then came the tipping point. My sister, in her desperate bid to get me back under control, decided to link my parents to my Reddit post. I don't know what she was expecting, but I guarantee it wasn't what happened next. My parents were absolutely horrified, not at me, but at the sheer number of strangers who sided with me. They had expected a comment section full of people chastising me, telling me to be a better brother and uncle. What they got instead was an endless wave of people pointing out how ridiculous it was for a grown man to be treated like a full-time babysitter just because he didn't have kids of his own. They saw people calling out their keep the peace mentality for what it really was, prioritizing my sister's comfort at my expense. They were furious. Not just at me for airing family drama online, though that was definitely part of it, but at my sister for putting them in a situation where they now had to face the uncomfortable truth they had been ignoring for years. For the first time, they could not just brush me off and tell me to deal with it. The internet had spoken, and it was unanimous, I was not the bad guy here. And that was when everything completely fell apart. The argument started almost immediately. My parents, embarrassed and angry, confronted my sister about what she had done. They accused her of being manipulative, of taking advantage of me for years, of never once considering how I felt. My sister, who had expected their full support, instead found herself on the defensive, lashing out in every direction. She blamed me, of course, for putting the family drama out in the open. She blamed our parents for turning against her. She even tried to blame the strangers online, as if their opinions somehow didn't matter because they weren't part of the family. Then came the final blow, the trip was cancelled. The hotel had not been booked yet, which meant that there were no deposits to lose, no reservations to cancel. My parents, now too exhausted and frustrated to deal with the mess my sister had made, decided that it was just not worth it anymore. Without me there to act as an extra set of hands, the idea of managing 3 wild kids on a beach vacation was suddenly not so appealing to them. My sister, of course, did not take this well. She threw a full-blown tantrum, accusing me of ruining everything because I was too selfish to help. And then came the cherry on top, my nephews found out. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about it soon enough. My sister, either out of frustration or an attempt to guilt-trip me even further, let it slip to her kids that the vacation was off. And, as one would expect from 3 young boys who had been promised sandcastles and ocean waves, they did not take it well. There were tears. There were tantrums. There was a full-on meltdown. And who did my sister blame for all of it? Me. She called me in the middle of my lunch break, her voice seething with barely contained rage. She accused me of not understanding how hard her life was, of not caring about her kids, of having no real responsibilities and therefore no excuse for not helping. It was the same tired argument, but this time, she said something that made my blood boil. She implied that I had no life. That I had nothing better to do, so why was I being so difficult? She sneered at the fact that I had time to myself, that I had the luxury of spending my money however I wanted, that I could take a vacation and actually enjoy it. She made it sound like because I was single, because I had no kids, my time wasn't as valuable as hers. And that was when I decided I had heard enough. I recorded the call. I did not do it out of spite, I did it because I knew my parents needed to hear the way she talked about me when she thought they weren't listening. After she hung up, I sent the recording to them with no explanation. I let her own words do the talking. And that was the final nail in the coffin. The next time I spoke to my parents, they were livid, not with me, but with her. They told me they had confronted her about the call, and things had escalated into another massive argument. They told her she was out of line, that I had every right to live my own life, and that she had no right to treat me like some kind of backup parent just because I was available. My father, who usually tried to stay out of conflicts like this, was especially furious, telling her that she needed to grow up and take responsibility for her own family. As of now, my sister and I are not speaking. She has gone radio silent, likely still fuming over the fact that her attempts to manipulate the situation backfired so spectacularly. My parents, though they are still upset with me for posting about it online, have at least started to acknowledge that they were part of the problem. They have apologized, tentatively, but it's a start. And me? Well, I still have my vacation time saved up. And now, instead of being stuck in a hotel room with 3 screaming kids, I get to plan a trip that is entirely on my terms. Maybe I'll still go to the coast. Maybe I'll go somewhere completely different. But wherever I go, one thing is certain, I will be enjoying every moment of it, free from the burden of being someone else's babysitter. After everything that went down, I thought things would finally settle into some kind of uneasy truce. My parents had finally acknowledged that last year was unfair to me, they promised not to push babysitting duties on me again, and, most importantly, I had won my freedom. My sister, on the other hand, had doubled down on her victim complex, but I figured that was just the usual cycle, she would stew in her anger, play the martyr, and eventually find something else to focus on. What I did not expect was just how deep she would dig herself into this mess. At first, she stuck to her usual playbook, complaining to anyone who would listen about how selfish I was, about how she had been abandoned by her own family, about how nobody understands how hard it is to be the mother of 3 wild boys. But the problem for her was that this time, our parents were not taking the bait. They were still furious about what she had said about me having no life, and every time she tried to spin the situation, they just shut her down. That was when she turned to extended family. I started getting messages from relatives, some neutral, some passive-aggressive, and some outright hostile. My aunt, who is one of those people who think that family means sacrifice no matter what, sent me a long-winded text about how it takes a village and how I was setting a bad example by refusing to do my part. A cousin messaged me asking if I was okay because he had heard I had freaked out over nothing. Apparently, my sister had started telling people that I had a meltdown and overreacted to something minor. But the most ridiculous was my grandmother, who, bless her old-school mentality, called to tell me she was praying for me to find a nice girl and settle down so I could finally understand what real responsibility was. Because, apparently, until I had a wife and kids of my own, I was just a selfish man-child who needed to learn how to contribute. It was exhausting. But it also backfired spectacularly on my sister. You see, she had been so focused on making me the villain that she completely overlooked the fact that other people actually knew what she was like. Some of our relatives, especially those who had kids of their own, started to push back. One of my uncles, who has 4 kids and actually takes care of them, flat out told her that she had no business demanding free labor from me. Another relative, an older cousin of ours who had been through similar issues with family dumping childcare responsibilities on him, sent me a message saying, "Good for you for standing your ground. She's just mad, she lost her free help." The more she tried to rally support, the more people started calling her out. Some brought up how she and her husband had always dumped the boys on others at family gatherings. Others pointed out how my parents had enabled her for years, making it so that she never had to fully handle her own responsibilities. But the real kicker? The moment that made everything come full circle? My brother-in-law, the man who should have been her biggest support, basically checked out completely. He had been silent for most of the fallout, which honestly did not surprise me. The guy is the definition of bare minimum dad. He works a lot, sure, but even when he is home, he is the type to retreat into his phone or find an excuse to leave the house rather than deal with the chaos. He was more than happy to let my sister pass the kids off to whoever was available, as long as it meant he didn't have to deal with them. But now, with the entire family drama exploding, he wanted absolutely no part of it. According to my parents, he had started working even longer hours, spending as much time as possible at the office, just to avoid being home. My sister, who had expected him to take her side and fight the battle for her, was left alone in her tantrum. And when she tried to push him into backing her up, he just shrugged and told her, "I don't want to deal with this." She lost her mind over that. She started throwing a fit about how he was leaving her to deal with everything and how it was so unfair that she had to handle all of it by herself. The irony of her own words was completely lost on her. She had spent weeks trying to make me the bad guy for not wanting to help with the kids, but now she was having a full-blown crisis over the fact that her own husband was refusing to step up. And the best part? My parents, who had finally started to see the light, did not come rushing in to save her. They had spent so much time catering to her needs, smoothing things over, making sure she never had to fully deal with the consequences of her own actions. But now, after everything that had happened, after the internet had collectively roasted them for how unfairly they treated me, they were done. So instead of taking her side, they told her to figure it out herself. That was the moment the reality of the situation finally started to sink in for her. She was out of allies. The free babysitting? Gone. The automatic sympathy from our parents? Gone. The ability to manipulate the situation into making me the villain? Completely shattered. And now, she had to actually deal with what she had created, a household where she and her husband had never truly worked as a team, where she had relied too much on other people to handle the hard parts of parenting, where she had taken for granted that there would always be someone there to bail her out. Her kids, who were still upset over the canceled trip, were making her life a living nightmare. Without anyone else to pass them off to, she had to actually handle their meltdowns, their energy, their constant need for attention. And with her husband completely disengaged, it was all on her. I would love to say that she learned some deep, meaningful lesson from all this, but knowing my sister, she will probably just keep playing the victim. As for me? I am good. Better than good, actually. Now that I have officially broken free from being the default babysitter, I have been making plans for my own vacation. I am thinking of going somewhere completely different this year, maybe a solo trip somewhere quiet, somewhere I can actually relax and enjoy myself without having to worry about being roped into someone else's responsibilities. The best part? My parents have finally stopped pressuring me. They have accepted that I am an adult with my own life, and they even admitted, grudgingly, that they should have never let things get this bad. As for my sister? Well, she is still sulking, still trying to find ways to spin the situation in her favor. But at the end of the day, she is the one who has to deal with the consequences of her actions. And I am finally free. In the aftermath of everything that went down, I found myself reflecting on the whole situation, how it escalated, how it fell apart, and where I stood in all of it. It would have been easy to just move on and bask in the fact that, for once, I wasn't being forced into a role I never wanted. But a small part of me couldn't help but wonder, had I handled things the right way? Was I really justified in standing my ground, or had I, as my sister had claimed, ruined everything by not just going along with it? I wrestled with that thought for a while. it lingered in the back of my mind as my family continued to deal with the fallout. My parents had finally accepted that what happened last year was unfair, and they promised they wouldn't push me into that role again. That was a win. But my sister? She had dug in so deep that I don't think she even realized she was standing in a hole of her own making. She was still playing the victim, still telling anyone who would listen that she had been betrayed by her own family. The funny thing was, the more she talked about it, the more people started to see through her. Because at the end of the day, I wasn't refusing to help her in an emergency. I wasn't abandoning her in some life or death situation. I was simply saying no to being forced into unpaid childcare during what was supposed to be my own vacation. When I looked at it like that, it became clear, I had every right to set that boundary. I wasn't the one who had promised my nephews a beach trip, I wasn't the one who had built up their expectations, only for it all to come crashing down when I refused to be the extra set of hands. My sister had always assumed that I would just go along with whatever plan benefited her, and when I didn't, it all fell apart. That wasn't my fault. If anything, it was a wake-up call that had been a long time coming. For years, I had been the one to keep the peace, to do what was expected of me, to take on responsibilities that weren't mine just because it was easier than dealing with the fallout. But what did that ever get me? More expectations. More pressure. More guilt-tripping whenever I tried to push back. And that's the thing, I wasn't just standing up for myself in this one instance. I was breaking a cycle. I was finally refusing to be the person who was always expected to step up just because I didn't have kids of my own. My time was just as valuable as anyone else's. My plans, my interests, my personal boundaries, they all mattered. And if saying no meant that my sister had to actually deal with her own responsibilities for once, then so be it. That wasn't on me. That was on her. And my brother-in-law? His complete apathy toward the entire situation made things even clearer. He wasn't stepping up. He wasn't arguing with me or trying to fight for my sister's side. He was just avoiding it altogether, because in his mind, this had never been his problem to begin with. And that? That was the real issue. My sister didn't need me to help her because she was overwhelmed, she needed me to help her because her own husband had long since checked out of parenting beyond the bare minimum. And honestly? That realization made me feel even less guilty. Maybe, deep down, my sister knew that too. Maybe that was why she was so desperate to get me back under control, to force me back into that familiar role of being the one who could step in and pick up the slack. Because without me as the built-in backup plan, she was left with the reality that she and her husband were on their own when it came to their kids. But here's the thing, I didn't make her have 3 children. I didn't make her marry someone who clearly wasn't interested in pulling his weight. And I certainly wasn't responsible for making sure her life was easier at my own expense. I had spent so long feeling guilty for putting myself first that it took this whole situation blowing up for me to realize that I didn't have to feel that way. Saying no didn't make me selfish. It didn't make me an asshole. It just made me someone who was tired of being taken advantage of. So, no. I don't think I did the wrong thing. Could I have handled it differently? Maybe. I could have laid things out more directly from the start, made it clear to my parents and sister that I was never going to agree to another trip under those conditions. I could have set that boundary earlier, rather than waiting for it to come to a head in such a public way. But honestly, given how my sister reacted, I don't think it would have changed much. She still would have thrown a fit. She still would have blamed me. The only difference is that it might have happened in private instead of being put on full display for everyone to see. But you know what? Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe, for once, she needed to be called out in a way that she couldn't manipulate or twist into something else. Maybe, for once, my parents needed to see firsthand just how unfair things had been. And maybe, just maybe, my sister needed to realize that she couldn't keep relying on me to clean up her messes. Will she ever actually learn that lesson? I have no idea. But I do know one thing, I won't be putting myself in that position again. I won't be the default babysitter. I won't be guilt-tripped into giving up my time just because I don't have kids. And I sure as hell won't be spending my vacations wrangling 3 hyperactive boys while my sister and her husband enjoy their alone time. This whole experience has been exhausting, frustrating, and honestly kind of surreal. But at the end of the day, I know I made the right choice. I stood up for myself. I set a boundary. I finally made it clear that I wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. And that? That's a win in my book.